Yesterday, we studied an inside a Chiddush of the Netziv, Mivalozhin, in his Sefer Meromei Sada, and I'd like to go over that again. And he quotes the Shita of Rebbe. Rebbe on Daf Tes has a principle with regard to our Mishnah that's called the Plukto Lokam Mayri. And anything that's recorded in our Mishnah is unanimously accepted. The Gemara raises an objection to Rebbe based on a Mishnah in the second chapter of Yevamos. And there the Mishnah says, Kol Yevama Hasura Be'isur Lav, Choletes V'lo Misyabemis. That if a woman is not included under the erva of karetz, but only under a lav, then she needs chalitza. And the Gemara points out that that's against Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva equates chayve lavim with chayve krisus, and Rabbi Akiva has an expanded definition of erva. And according to Rabbi Akiva's definition of erva includes even chayve lavim. And therefore, she doesn't fall for yibum at all, and she doesn't require chalitza. So the Gemara then goes ahead and differentiates between our Mishnah here at the beginning of Masech Yevamos and the Mishnah later on in the second parak. And even Rebbe, who says that Bepluta Lokam Mayri, would admit that the second chapter is already different. That's a separate entity, and there we are presenting one opinion amongst many when there's a machlokas. Since the Netziv, we should ask the following question. Our Mishnah has a list of 15 arayos. And because the Mishnah lists a number, which is called Minyan Olamali, why did the Mishnah have to tell me the number? I can count it up myself. It means to exclude anything else. And Chayve Lavim don't appear on this list. So therefore, the clear implication of our Mishnah is that only Chayve Krisus and Chayve Mises Bezdin pater her up from Yibum, but in the case of Chayve Lavim, she would fall for Yibum. And that's against Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says that Chayve Lavim are pater from Chalita and Yibum. How do we reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva? And therefore, we must come to the conclusion that B'plukta Kamayri, that our Mishnah is reflecting the view of the Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva, and the bottom right red line, the minimum requirement of erva to knock off yibum is chayve krisis, but chayve lavim are included in yibum and chalitza. So how can the Gemara reconcile Rebbe, who holds b'plukta loka mayri, with our Mishnah that clearly is b'plukta mayri? It's reflecting the shita of the Chachamim against the sheet of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva would say that Chayve Lavim would also have the status of an erva. This is the great kasha of the Netziv Mivalozhin. In order to answer this kasha, the Netziv now reflects on the question of, which is again a machlokes between the Tanoim, what is the source in the Torah from which we derive the din of tsaras erva, that a tsaras erva does not fall for yibum? We have two approaches to this question. The Brisa, which we'll see on Daf Gimel, is going to derive the p'tur of tsaras erva, from the pasuk in Achos Ishto. It says litzrar, whereas Rebbe has a different drasha from the word v'lakcha, and Rebbe analyzes the extra hey in the word v'lakcha to mean that when two wives of the person who passed away, we call him Shimon, right? When they fall for yibum, Yibum will only apply when it's v'lakcha, when he, the Yavam, has two choices, two possibilities, and they're both equal. He can decide which one of the two he wants to be miyabed. But in a case where he cannot possibly be married to both of them, he doesn't have two alternatives. When these two wives of Shimon fall for Yibum, then the whole enterprise of Yibum is completely overboard. So let's just review. According to the Brisa, the anonymous Brisa on Daf Gimel, how do we derive the Ptur of Tsaras Erva from the word Litzra in the Pasuk in Achos Isha? According to Rebbe, on the other hand, we derive the Ptur of Tsaras Erva from the Pasuk Vilakcha. In the light of that introduction, the Netziv wants to offer the following answer to his kasha. And he says the following. If you accept the Shita of the Brisa, and we're going to derive the Ptur of Tsaras Erva from Litzra, then we have to be bound by the Malamed, right? The Dayol of Adin. The Malamed here is Achos Isha. That's where the Torah says Litzra. Achos Isha is a higher, more stringent level of erva than Chayve Lavin, because Achos Isha is a Chiv Kares. And therefore, if we would accept the Shita of the Brisa, then we could answer the following kasha. We could say that our Mishnah here at the beginning of Yevamis can be reconciled even with Rabbi Akiva. And why is that? Because our Mishnah is telling us which arayos contagiously, if we can use that word, pater that sorrows. And here we are limited to chayve krisis. We are bound by chayve krisis because the makar, the source in the Gemara, from which we derive the ptur of tzaras erva, is achos isha, and therefore that ptur of tzaras erva will be limited to those arayos that is similar to achos isha and have that minimum stringency of a chiyuv kares, to the exclusion of chayve lavin. Even Rabbi Akiva will therefore accept our Mishnah if we integrate Rabbi Akiva with the drasha, the price of Litzrar, that only 15 arayos will pater that sorrows, because what's common to all these 15 is they are chayve krisis and above, but not chayve lavin, which are below. If, on the other hand, says the Netziv, we would operate within the framework of Rebbe's drasha of Lakcha, which means that Yibum only applies when the Yavam has two viable options. In that context, we would not be able to make any differentiation between Chayve Krisis and Chayve Lavin, because Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that even in the case of Chayve Lavin, Einon Cholzos U'Misyavmos, they have the upgraded status of an erva that knocks them out of the parsha of Yibum. In which case, according to the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, we would pater up that tsaras as well. Why? Because if you have a tsara of a chayve lavim according to Rabbi Akiva, you cannot apply the yardstick of a lakcha, which means that the yavam doesn't have two options, because there is no yibum according to Rabbi Akiva in the case of chayve lavim. So the tsara of chayve lavim, let's say the tsara of a mamzeres, or an almana lekohen gadol, or a grusha or a zona to a kohen hedger, in all those cases of chayve lavim, there is no yibum. He doesn't have the option as a yavam of choosing that particular woman, because Rabbi Akiva upgrades chayve lavim to the state of what? Status of an erva. So there's no yibum. Then there's no lakcha. There's no application of lakcha. That in the case where these two wives fall for yibum, he has the option of marrying both of them. He cannot marry both of them. Is therefore, if we accept and operate within the framework of the drasha of the lakcha, then Rabbi Akiva would say that chayve lavim, not only are they excluded from Yibum, but that tsaras are excluded from Yibum, because there's no V'lakcha option. But our Mishnah reflects the sheet of the Brisa that we derive the Torah of Tzaras Erev from Litra. And therefore, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that Chayvei Lavin did not generate a Ptur in their Tzara because Chayvei Lavin is not Dumya, it's not similar to Achos Ishto, which is the paradigm, the Malamed from which we derive the Ptur of Tzaras Erev. He says the following, I'll just read it inside. He says, Afal Rebbe Adoresh Ptur Tzara Mivalakcha. Ein lechalik ben chayvei lav l'chayvei krisus l'shitas Rabbi Akiva. Because since chayvei lav enon cholzos u'misyamos, is therefore they're included in this scenario of litzor, v'yesh lem liftar gam es sorol seya. Any woman who's not included in the mitzvah of yibum, patas hot sarah because of the pasuk litzor, including chayvei lav, according to Rabbi Akiva's expanded scope. Sharei afhen. So wait a minute. So that's if we derive. So again, let's just go over this. If we derive the Torah of Tzaras Erev from Litzar, then even Rabbi Akiva would agree that only Chayvei Krisus and up would pater up that Tzara, because that's Dumya de Achos Ishta. But if Rabbi Akiva would accept the drasha of Rebbe of Velokcha, then in the case of Chayvei Lavin, there would be a ptur of Tzaras Chayvei Lavin. And that should have been listed in our Mishnah. The Mishnah limits it to 15, the Chayvei Krisus and above. Hence, our Mishnah is Beplugta Mayri. It reflects the Shita of the Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva. The only problem with this approach is that Tosfos later on Daf Yud happens to go on record as maintaining that Rabbi Akiva would hold that Chayvei Lav do pater up that service, which would mean that Tosfos is somehow integrating Rabbi Akiva with the sheet of Rebbe of Velakcha, and there's no Velakcha in the case of Chayvei Lavin. Hence, that paters up the tzara from Yibum, which is against our Mishnah. Therefore, according to Tosfos, how would we understand that beplugta loka mayri? We are actually entering into this minefield. We're actually going up against Rabbi Akiva. So that's what we have from the Netziv. And now we go back to our analysis. The sugya here on Daf Beis, Amud Beis, Gimel, Amud Aleph, about the sequence of the 15 arayos as reflected in our Mishnah. If you recall, the Gemara wanted to try to present the Shita, the methodology, we could call it the literary principle that governs our Mishnah, and that is that the erva, which is more chamura, comes first in the list. And in that case, when our Mishnah begins with Bito as number one on the list, we would say the following, that since Bito generates a chiyuv misa, therefore it's the most chamur of all the arayos listed in the Mishnah, therefore it comes first. The Gemara immediately objects because chamoso is also a chiyuv misa, and in fact, both chamoso and bito generate sreifa. According to Rabbi Shimon, in Masechta Sanhedrin, sreifa is the most strict or severe of all the misas bezin. So therefore, we're going to start with chamoso and bito because those fit into the category of chiyuv sreifa. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, then it makes more logical sense for the Mishnah to have begun with chamoso than with bito. Because how do we know that in the case of bito there's a chiyuv sreifa? We derive it from chamoso. Again, let's just go back to the Gemara for a moment. And the Gemara says on Daf Beis Amud Beis, Vichtei Kulo me'achos isha yalfil, this ne'achos isha bereisha. V'chi tema, and if you'll suggest that the rule of sequence that governs our Mishnah is ana chumrei chumrei nokit, and now we're reflecting the shita of Rabbi Shimon that streifa is chamura mi skila. So bito is first on the list because the onesh for bito is streifa. And once we mentioned bito, we mentioned bas bito and bas bino. All these are included in the chiyuv streifa. Then we go on to chamoso and all those relatives through chamoso, which are all a chiyuv streifa. Okay, then that's what we have here. The only thing I just want to clarify one point over here, and that is, let's keep in mind that the Mishnah does have one other category of an erev that generates a chiyuv mitzvah, and that's kalasa. But there it's only a chiyuv skila, so the Gemara understands that since Rabbi Shimon holds that streifa is chamura biskila, it makes sense that kalaso is listed later than bito and chamos. However, if you're operating, says the Gemara, with the principle of chumrei nokat, then chamosa should be first, because the chiyuv streifa of bito is a derivative of chamosa. And therefore, it makes more sense if you're going through chumrah and tana chumrei noket that we should begin with the av, or the malade, the paradigm case, which would be chamosa. And now we have a kasha from the Netziv. The Netziv quotes a Tosfos on Daf Sadi Dalid Amud Beis. Can you imagine how much knowledge you have to have in Masechet Yevamos to ask this kasha? Tosfos on Daf Sadi Dalid Amud Beis says that our Mishnah includes even chamoso li'achar misas ishta. So his wife died, and now he has a relationship with his mother-in-law. And Rabbi Akiva would say that there's no streifa. Rabbi Akiva holds, and this is a general rule in Arayos, according to Rabbi Akiva, that if the erva comes from Mrs. X, and that's why Y is an erva, that erva applies as long as Mrs. X is alive. After her death, we no longer have the severity of that erva vis-a-vis Y. But Tosfos says that our Mishnah would apply even in the case of chamotzo liachar misas ishto, even according to Rabbi Akiva. And this despite the fact that there's no chiyuv streifa. We go down one notch. And it's now only a chiyuv kares. And therefore, our Mishnah would say that even chamoso liachar misas ishto patters up hatzara because she, meaning chamoso, is a chiyuv kares in this case after the death of his wife. There's the Netziv, according to this Tosfos, then what is the Gemara asking? Listening chamoso bereisha. I can't mention chamoso bereisha. You want to say chamoso is more chamor because she incurs a chiyuv streifa. That's not true, because our Mishnah is talking about a case, or even a case, I should say, where his wife died. If his wife died, then chamoso is no longer a chiyuv streifa. So what would make it more chamor? Brilliant question of the Netziv. Again, you can only ask this question if you know Tosfos on page 94b. We're up to 2b. So the Netziv offers the following answer. that we're going to go now in the Gemara according to the sheet of Abaye, and Abaye holds that even after the death of his wife Chamoso, even according to Rabbi Akiva, is besreifa. It still remains and retains its chumrah, its severity of sreifa. That's Abaye's opinion. Tosfos there is not going to according to Abaye when he says that our Mishnah includes even Chamoso liachar misas ishto, because according to Abaye, Chamoso liachar misas ishto generates a chiv sreifa. And Tosfos is saying, well, there's no chiv sreifa, but there's a chiv kares, and that's an atapata of the tzara of Chamos. Again, what comes out according to this Netziv is a brilliant conclusion, and that is that Chamoso, according to Tosfos there, would not be appropriate for the first line in that Mishnah, because it's not a front line Chiyuv Sreifa if we're talking about Liachar Misas Ishto, because according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no Chiyuv Sreifa, so that now Chamoso is no longer a candidate to be number one, because the reason why Chamoso is a candidate to be number one is because of the Chiyuv Sreifa. But in the case of Liachar Misas Ishto, according to Rabbi Akiva, there is no Chiyuv Sreifa, and therefore Chamoso would not be a candidate, which is really good news, because that really answers the question why Chamos is not listed first. But it's bad news because the Gemara thinks that Chamos should be listed first. The answer is the Gemara is not asking according to Abaye. I'm sorry. The Gemara is asking Dafka according to the sheet of Abaye that in the case of Chamoso, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that even after the death of his wife, there's still a Chiyuv Sreifa. Now, the Gemara tries to suggest the following answer, which is not going to hold water, but it's a very good answer. And the Gemara says, you know what? You want to claim that Chamosa should come before Bito because Chamosa is the source from which we derive Bito. Says the Gemara, we have another rule that I call it a Mishnaic literary literature that governs the sequence of a Mishnah, and that is Bidrasha, Chavivah. That which we derive from a drasha is very beloved in the eyes of the Tana and should be listed first. Probably that's a reflection of the fact that the Mishnah is Torah Sheba'al Peh, and Torah Sheba'al Peh should be connected to Torah Shebechsav. And if we have a drasha, then we link up Torah Shebechsav with Torah Sheba'al Peh. In any event, so came in the Asya Midrasha Chaviva. This would give preference to Bito over Chamos. Now, what kind of Bito are we talking about? We can't be talking about Bito mi Ishto because the Torah explicitly tells us that Bas Ishto is an Erev. And if he fathers a daughter in the framework of marriage, of wedlock, then that daughter is explicitly prohibited in the Torah under Bas Ishto. So apparently, we have no choice but to assume that Bito in our Mishnah is a reference to Bito Me Anu Saso. It's his daughter out of wedlock. And that's derived from a drasha. So what we want to do is we want to try to learn that drasha. So for that, I need a chumash. Yikra would be helpful. Let's see if we can find this. Okay. So that's the Gemara's point here, that Bito is Asya Mi Drosh. Bito Asya Mi Drosha. And let's see if we can open up the Chumash here and figure out this drosha. We're going to open up to Vayikra Yud Ches, the end of Parshas Achrei Mos, and we'll take a look at Pasuk Yud and then Pasuk Yud Zayin. So in Pasuk Yud, the Torah says, Ervas bas bincha o bas bitcha lo sigal. So we're talking about a grandfather and his granddaughter, either through his son or through his daughter. Lo sigal ervas. Now, let's fast forward to Pasuk Yud Zayin. It says, Ervas isha ubita lo sigal. Es bas binov, es bas bita lo sikach legalos ervasa she'era hena zima hi. What's the difference here between the two psukim? I mean, obviously, in the second one, that's Pasuk Yud Zayin, the Torah emphasizes isha. In the first pasuk, the word isha doesn't appear at all. It's ervas bas bincha bas bit. Now, there's a second difference here, which is more or less the same as the first, but it's a little bit more fleshed out, so to speak. Because in Pasuk Yud Zayin, the Torah gives you the source and the primary erva, and that's isha, and then it goes on to bita. In Pasuk Yud, it says bas bincha o bas bitcha, but what's missing here is the source of this erva. Now, no, it's obviously the Torah is prohibiting a granddaughter in this case. We'll call it a granddaughter. But the Torah doesn't say the first generation, if you follow what I mean, the first generation erva. So again, just to emphasize these two differences, in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Isha is mentioned. So you're talking about a wife, and that's completely omitted in Pasuk Yud. And the second difference is that the wife, which is explicit in Pasuk Yud Zayin, is the source of all these arayos. Because she's your wife, therefore, Ervas Bita lo segala, Ervas Baspina, El Bas Bita, all these offspring, the generations of your wife. In the case of Pasuk Yud, the wife is completely omitted, and more than that, by omitting the wife, you don't have the source of the erva. You have Bas Bincha, you have Bas Bitcha, but you made no mention of that first generation of erva, which is the Bas. So what we're going to do here in this very, very sophisticated drasha is we're going to assume that there are two different cases of Bas. The case of Pasuk Yud Zayin is a Bas because she's the daughter of your wife. In the case of Pasuk Yud, we don't know anything about your daughter if she's not the daughter of your wife. Now, how can you have a daughter who's not the daughter of your wife? The answer is anusasa, in a rape situation. So whereas Pasuk Yud Zayin is addressing a marriage situation and a bas that came from a marriage, Pasuk Yud is going to be indicative of a bas that came out of wedlock, anusasa. But again, we can only come to that conclusion based on a drasha, which is going to allow us to use Pasuk Yud Zayin, in the case of Ervas Isho Bita, to shed a light on Bas Bincha. And what that Pasuk Yud Zayin is doing for us here is it's sort of like alluding to the source of this erva and going back and saying, well, that bas is not the same bas as this bas in Pasuk Yud Zayin, because the Pasuk Yud Zayin, that's bas ishtacha. Pasuk Yud is referring to bitcha she'ena bas ishtacha, which means anusasa, bas anusasa. And now the Torah is telling you that bas anusaso is the same as bas ishto in terms of the potency of the avera. I'm sorry, of the erva, and therefore it's going to generate an erva in the next generation, which is going to be bas bitcha. So bas bitcha is going to be a result of bitcha, but she's not bas ishtacha. So to make a long story short, if a man has a daughter through marriage, that daughter is prohibited under bas ishto, and that's explicit in the Torah. But if a man has a daughter out of wedlock, so she's not bas ishto, she's bas anusaso, that's going to be derived from the equation between these two psukim. So that's called midrasha, and that's going to justify why Bito is listed first in our Mishnah before Chamosa. And that's flexing the principle of Keva di Asya Midrasha Chaviva. Now, if you take a look at the first line in Tosfos on Daf Beis Amud Beis, the last Tosfos Bito, Hainu Bito Me'anu Sasa. So in other words, Bito Minasu Aso is explicit in the Torah. She is Eras Bas Ishtacha, which is explicit in Pasuk Yud Zayin that we saw, correct? When the Gemara says that Bito is Asya Midrasha, referring to Bito Me'anu Sasa. Now comes the kasha. And this is going to be the kasha Tosfos, which is summarized here on page Yud in the Yalkut Biurim, and we could go back to Tosfos himself in the original on Daf Beis Amud Beis. Madua lo nomar bozeh haklal ein onchim min hadin. Tosfos is working with the premise that if a man has a daughter through his wife within the framework of wedlock, then she comes under the erva of bas ishto, because the fact that she is also his biological daughter doesn't in any way undermine the status of this girl as bas ishto. But the Torah says bas ishto, as I state in the pasuk. It says eras isho bita lo segal. If you're deriving a case where it's not only bas ishto but it's also bito, then you're applying the logic of a kal v'chomer. If this woman is an erva because she's the daughter of his wife, how much more so if she's not only the daughter of his wife but it's his daughter? We have a principle called Einon Shemin Adin. So, for example, the Torah is going to tell us here in this same parsha that if he has a sister who is the daughter of his mother, or he has a sister who's the daughter of his father, that's called an erva of achoso. But nowhere does the Torah mention that if he has a daughter, he has a sister who's the daughter of both his father and his mother, that she's considered an erva. And the Gemara says the reason that this is going to teach us and reflect the principle of Ein Od Shemin Adin. So the paradox is you have a woman who's only your maternal sister, you have a woman who's only your paternal sister in those two cases. And you want to derive logically that what if she's also your full-fledged sister? You can't derive that because Ein Od Shemin Adin. So if this woman was the daughter of your wife, that's explicit in the Torah. Now you want to derive, well, what happens if she's also your daughter? That's like the case where she's your sister through both your father and your mother, and we apply the principle of Ein Od Shemin Adin. Well, that's the kasha of this Tosfos that begins here on the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Beis. Lahala legabi Yisra choso mimashenem achoscha bas avicha o bas imecha. All right, we have to find that pasuk wherever it is. Oh, here it is. Pasuk Tes. Erbas achoscha bas avicha o bas imecha. You see, there's a printing error. It says bas and bas. Right, I found a few of these errors. But anyway, it's aim lanu elabas aviv she'ena basimo. O bas imo she'ena bas aviv. Avo bas aviv she bas gam bas imo. What's the story? Ein onshim min adin. And therefore, the Gemara justifies that at the end of this pasuk, the Torah adds two words, achoscha hi. L'rabos, a full-fledged sister. Harei afshe misvara b'vadei logara bas aviv she bas imo mi bas aviv levad. I mean, this woman who's also your mother's daughter, you share the same mother, not just the same father. She certainly should be no worse than a sister that's explicit in the Torah that has, you say, the same father. She doesn't have you say. But nevertheless, we need a special Yalfusa L'Rabos because Ein Od Shemin Adin. So we should apply the same principle here to the case of Bito Mi Ishto as opposed to Bas Ishto. So if this girl is the daughter of your wife, and the Torah says she's an heir to you, how much more so if she's also at the same time your daughter? The fact that she's your daughter shouldn't be in any way logically go rare from the fact that she's also your wife's daughter. But since we have a principle of Ein Od Shemin Adin, we cannot make these logical deductions. So on this Tosfos, we have a paragraph of the Kovetz HaOros, Reb Elchanan Wasserman, on the next column. Now, I can't say that I totally understand Reb Elchanan, but I'm hoping that together as a Chabura, we'll figure it out. He doesn't understand the analogy between the two cases, the case of the full sister and the case of the full daughter, if you follow me. He says, "Harei b'makom sheshnei shemos isur, v'ali sheyesh l'chayev al shneim." The law of reading was that Ein Od Shemin Adin. The Gamba Bito Minisu also yesh shnei isurim, echad mishum bas ishto, v'echad mishum bito. In Cain, My hikshu atosus she'en lechayva mishum bas ishto lefi she'en on shemin adin. These are called two shemos isur. Now, the first time I read this, I came to the following conclusion. Then I slugged it up. The Torah gives us two parshas. We had in Perek Ches we have pasuk Yud, and we have pasuk Yud Zayin. Pasuk Yud Zayin gives me a long list of the relatives, the genealogy, the doros of Ishto. Pasuk Yud, on the other hand, is addressing his own biological daughter, and that's called Shnei Shemos Isur. Meaning that since in the case of his biological daughter, that's called Anusaso, second, let me just get this right. Let's leave out Anusaso for a minute. How do we know that Anusaso is not included in this parsha, in this pasuk Yud of Ishto? Tosa says, when the Torah delineates the generations of Ishto, logically we should say that if that Bas is not only Bas Ishto, but also Bito, then how much more so should be included in this Erev? So Tosa says, against that logic, we have a principle called Einon Shemin Adin, that we're not permitted to use logic and derive Isurim from logic, from Kal V'chomer. Says Rabbi Chanan, that doesn't make any sense in this case, because we have a parsha of Anusasa, which is pasuk Yud. And that generates a Shem Isur unto itself, which is generated by the fact that it's his daughter. So what are you going to tell me that, well, if he has a daughter within the framework of marriage, we're deriving that erva from Ishto, from Bas Ishto? Says Rabbi Chanan, no. That premise is incorrect. Because Bito and Bas Ishto are two shemos. They're fundamentally two different categories of arayos. There's one ever called Bas Ishto, and she's prohibited to you because she is the daughter of your wife. There's another erva called Bito, like for example, in the case of Anusaso, just to give it an example, where it's not Bas Ishto, but it's Bito. Now, what happens in a case where you have an overlap? And it's not just Bas Ishto, but it's also Bito within a framework of marriage. Tosis is applying the principle of Einon Shemin Adin. That's ridiculous. What do you mean Einon Shemin Adin? We have two different Shemos of Isur. We have equal rights here to classify this erva under any one of two categories. Under the category of erva that's generated by Ishto, and a category of erva that's generated by the fact that she's Bito, it's his daughter. Don't tell me Einon Shemin Adin. In the case of Achoso, the Torah has two categories, but one is Bas Aviv and the other is Bas Imo. Now you want to Isn't that also called Shnei Shem? See, that's where I get lost in this whole fun. If she's also Bas Aviv and also Bas Imo, she's a full sister, so then we're going to apply the principle. Oh, I got it. Yeah, because we still don't have that extra two words that are redundant, achos chahi. So until we get to achos chahi, we apply the principle of Einon Shemin Adin. Because to create a shame Easter of full-fledged sister, that we don't have the right to do. We only have two shemos of achoso. We have achoso bas Aviv and achoso bas Imo. But in the case of Bito, we have two categories of Easter. We have a category of bas Ishto, because she's the daughter of my wife. We have a category of Bito, because she's my daughter. And those are two shemos. How can you apply the principle of Einon Shemin Adin? That's what we'll find in Kasha. The Rotza Lomar, Shedas HaTosfos, Shedas HaRavid. Okay, this is a Rambam and a Ravid at the beginning of Hilchas Isurei Bia. Ein Chayev Shtayim al Bito Minisu Asa. Okay, so there's a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ravid in the case of Ishto Minisu Asa. The Rambam says that you chayev for two categories of arayos. Now, you'll have to ask yourself the question, my nafkamini, you can't kill him twice, right? You could add a couple extra stones to the skila, but it's the same skila, whether you have 5 stones or 10 stones. So what is the Rambam's point over here? So that we have to come back to answer that question. But be that as it may, if the Rambam says that you have a daughter in the framework of marriage, she's both Bas Ishto and Bito. So we have now an overlap of two different Isurim. And that's going to lead us to the kasha of the Kovetz Shiurim, Kovetz Aros. But according to the Ravid, no. If she's Bas Nisuaso, then that's one single Erva. She's also Bito, but Bito and Bas Nisuaso, meaning Bas Ishto, are all the same. It's one Isa. However, the Ravid agrees that if a man would have a relationship with his biological daughter, who's also the biological daughter of his wife, so she's both Bito and Bas Ishto, then we're going to have a separate plot in the cemetery to bury such a guy after we put him to death. That's called the Kovro Bein Rishoim. He has Chamurim, or I know it as Rishoim Gemurim. He's a Russia to the second degree, because this woman is his daughter, not only through his biological, but through his wife's biological. Both. But fundamentally, the Ravid objects to the Rambam, who says that Bas Nisu Aso and Bito is all one the same. Meaning, in the case of Bas Nisu Aso, she is Bito, but the Rambam can't be right. The Rambam can't be right to say that there are two Chiyuve Misa here. That there's a Chiyuv Misa b'Torah Bas Ishto and another one b'Torah Bito. That can't be, says the Rambam. It's all one Isa. And it's called Bito. That's the Rambam's position. Is Memela, we have to apply the principle of Einon Shemin Adin. If we make an interdependence between Tosfos and the Ravid against the Rambam, then Tosfos makes sense. How can we say in the case of Bito from marriage that we're going to derive that from a Kavachom from Bas Ishto? And then Tosfos says we should apply the principle of Einon Shemin Adin That's ridiculous. That the whole kasha, the premise of this, that otherwise kasha tosis is untenable because we have here two shemos of Isa. You don't apply Einot Shimon Din when you have two different categories. The answer is that the Rambam that Tosfos holds against the Rambam like the Ravid, and the Ravid insists that a woman who's both Bito and Bas Ishto, that's all one Isa. But he says that doesn't make any sense. Why? He says, Af Lashitas Ravid, this can't be a right answer. Why? The Ravid admits that Kovrin also ben Rishonim Chamurin, that we have a special plot, a special area in the cemetery where we bury full-fledged Rishonim. And this guy deserves to be placed in that burial because he not only had a relationship with his wife's daughter, but it was also his daughter at the same time. Is Muchra, we see clearly that the Ravid also agrees, She'asura mishum shnei shemos. Again, we can only implement one Misas Bezdin, but there are two separate Mechayim here, because otherwise, if you don't piggyback one on top of the other, why are you designating that area in the cemetery for the Rishonim Chamurin? It must be that they're two Shemos. So the Nitziv therefore says we're not going to gain a thing by making a marriage here between Tosfos and the Ravid. Says Reb David Povarsky, the Rosh Hashiva of Panovich. I don't understand the Kovitz Haaretz. Sorry, Kol Ma Shechayavim Al Bito Me Ishto Shtayim. Your whole premise that if she is his daughter within a marriage framework, there's two different Isurim. That's only after we have this entire sophisticated Racha over here, the Gzeira Shava Mibas Ishto. But when Tosfos raises his kasha, he doesn't know yet that we have this drasha. Elakushas Tosfos imikach sha'al bito mi ishto chayev misvara af below drasha zu. That if a man has a daughter in wedlock, Tosfos thinks in his kasha, we don't need a drasha to derive the conclusion that this is included in the Iser Erev of Bito. So Lule Gzeira Shava, even without the Gzeira Shava, Tosfos thinks that l'chora we should derive the conclusion that if it's a case of Bas Ishto within marriage, that's included in the Ereva of Bito. But then Tosfos says, what about Einot Shimon Adin? All this is before the Gzeira Shava. And if before the Gzeira Shava, we only have one category of Isa. We only have Bito. And if we only have Bito, then you're adding Bito that's his own biological daughter, then you should apply the principle of Einot Shimon Adin. Tosfos shechayev al Bito mi ishto mi svara. In locain, minayin lonu shikseir shova bol rabos is pas anusaso Bito mi anusaso shema bol rabos rak Bito mi nesuas. The Eina Chiv Ba Machma Shem Bito or Machma Shem Bas Ish. Tosfos thinks that there's no justification to use the Gzeira Shava to derive Bas Anusaso because we need that Gzeira Shava to teach us Bito. Because of the principle of Einot Shimon Adin, because Bito is also Bas Ish. But Tosfos is operating with the premise that there's only one category of erva, and that's called bito. Tosfos wants to sneak into that category of bito, even a woman who's both bas ishto and bito is biological within the framework of marriage. Tosfos says, but we can't do that because they know shemin adin. And therefore, we need to establish that in the case of bito binisu also, that's also a category of erva unto its own. And therefore, any Gzeira Shava now cannot be used to derive the conclusion of bito me'ansa, so we need it for bito me'ishto. That's Tosfos' count. Okay. Now we have a very strange Gemara. The Gemara thinks that even though bito has this plus, as we called it, a mile, that it's derived from a drasha. We're talking about the Gzeira Shava that's going to teach us bito me anusaso. But nevertheless, all the 15, well, I should say 14 out of the 15 arayas listed in the Mishnah are all derived from a drasha. The only case that the Torah says that an Erev Pat is a what you call it, a tsara, is only in the case of achos ichto, lisra. All the other arayas are derived from an equation to achos ishto. So they're all derived from drosh. So why then do you put bito on the top of this? He says, L'chora, ein bekach, this is the Maharsha's kasha, ein bekach mishum pirchal ikar teretz ha-gemara liyelo. V'siyus mashal oposka tanim achos ishto, sharei achos isha, eina midrasha, ela mi-mikra mefurash. You see, we had two kashas here in the Gemara. We had a problem why bito is first. We had a problem why kalotzo is last. And we had a kasha that achos ishto should be first. Because this halacha that all 15 arayos patter up that source, it's all derived from achos isha. So achos isha deserves to get the first bid here. And Tosfos says you haven't really given an answer to that question. The Maharsha says, well, what was your answer? Kula nami bidracha asa. Yeah, but why should achos isha be first? As the Maharsha, this is what the Gemara was asking. Me'achar shekol harayos shavos b'kach shepeturim miyibum v'nilma midrasha. Im kein shuv tikshe kushas haGemara li'el yesh lahaktin chamoso l'shar harayos. Oil v'ikar din sreifa nichtav ba. When the Gemara says kula nami midrasha asi, says the Maharsha, the Gemara is now asking, why is it that chamoso is not first on the list? So in other words, what the Maharsha is doing here is he's shifting the entire emphasis here of this Gemara, of this kasha of the Gemara. We thought that the kasha of the Gemara was you should start with achos isha, because kula nami midrasha kasha. Nay, that's not the Gemara's kasha. The Gemara is asking why bito comes first. L'chora chamosa should come first. What are you going to answer to me that bito is derived from chamoso? But all the arayos are derived from a hekesh tachos isha, so they're all derived from a drosh. So why do you have chamoso after bito? And chamoso logically should come before bito because the din of bas is derived from chamoso. I mean the chiyuv straight. All right, so let's make a note of where we got up to. Now, he quotes here a sefer called the Madura Basra. I was unable to figure out, if you could help me with this, Who authored this Madura Basra? I was very curious about it. I have a feeling it's someone who lived between, like after the Marsha, but close to the Marsha, centuries ago. I'm not sure. Okay, then. So this is where we'll end it for today. I wish you a great day.